A warm welcome to everyone here this evening, and welcome to all those joining us live online. My name is Neil Cox, and I'm the head of the Leonard Lauder Research Centre for Modern Art here at the Met. It's my great pleasure to introduce our third speaker in this fall series of talks, Professor Charles Haxthausen, who everyone in the Research Centre and probably many people in this room know as Mark Haxthausen. He can explain that later. Mark was with us as a distinguished scholar in, I've written 1919 to 20. I think I meant 2019 to 20. By his and his residency was stymied by the pandemic, of course. So he's rejoined us here over the last 6 weeks to complete his research and offer us the chance to hear his lecture on it. He's asked me to rotate the slide, so I'll give you something beautiful to look at. Now retired in his long career, Mark has taught at Indiana University, at Harvard, where he held a joint curatorial appointment at the Bush-Reisinger Museum, at the University of Minnesota, and finally at Williams College, where he taught for 23 years, with 14 of those as the director of the Williams Clark Art Institute MA program. Among his awards are a 2009 College Art Association Award for Distinguished Teaching in Art History in recognition of the leadership of that MA program, and a 2012 Award for Excellence Outstanding Exhibition in a University Museum in North America from the Association of Art Museum Curators for Sol LeWitt, The Well-Tempered Grid, Williams College Museum of Art. He was the curator of that and, of course, authored the catalogue. He'll be known to many as a scholar of 20th century German art and art criticism, and is also editor of the influential volume, The Two Art Histories, the Museum and the University, based on a very successful conference published by the Clark Institute and Yale University Press in 2002. Most recently, he published the outstanding book of writings by Carl Einstein, A Mythology of Forms, Selected Writings on Art, 1912 to 35. That's Chicago and London, 2019. This book features 14 texts that Mark translated and on which he wrote extensive and very illuminating commentaries. Tonight's lecture relates to his new book project, Reassessing Paul Klee's Place in European Modernism. He is going to be happy to answer questions afterwards, but please join me in welcoming Professor Haxthausen.
Thank you very much, Neil, and begin by thanking Neil for inviting me back to give the lecture that was canceled because of the pandemic. And it's been the 6 weeks here under his leadership have been really marvelous and wonderful. I've enjoyed getting to know Neil better and also getting to know our four fellows. I'd also like to thank Stephanie D'Alessandro, who was head of the Research Center when I first came. And tonight's topic actually grew out of conversations that we had in the spring of 2020. So she was really instrumental in pushing my research in this project. I'd also like to thank Eva Wiedeker-Sladacek, who was the archivist and librarian at the Zentrum Paul Klee in Bern, who provided me with an Excel spreadsheet of all of Klee's works and techniques, on which I relied very heavily in this lecture. You'll hear some very precise numbers, which I could not have done going through 9 volumes of the Catalogue Raisonné. So anyway, thanks to her. And then finally, last and certainly not least, the two conservators, Isabelle Duvernois and Rachel Nostalish, the painting and paper conservators, respectively, and my interactions and consultations with them have really been a high point of my time at the Met. I learned a great deal from it. I got some great slides, and anyway, they've been really instrumental to this talk. Among the rich Paul Klee holdings of the Rosengart collection in Lucerne, Switzerland, is this work, Castle of the Believers, from 1924. In the Catalogue Raisonné for Klee's art, it carries the following technical description: watercolor, oil glaze, and tempera on a ground of blue-colored paste on paper, bordered in gouache and ink, above and below margin strips in watercolor and ink on paperboard. Watercolor, oil, tempera, gouache, colored paste, and ink. This work must be unsurpassed in Klee's oeuvre for an agglomeration of mediums in a single work. Yet it's typical of a defining feature of his art, virtually from his beginnings up to his death in 1940, a continual exploration of varying and unconventional combinations of materials. Lothar Schreier, who from 1921 to 1924 served as head of the workshop for stagecraft at the Bauhaus in Weimar, recalled the vivid impression Klee's studio there made on him. Here I was again in the magic kitchen. Certainly our entire Bauhaus in Weimar was a laboratory, but this was truly the magic kitchen. There was a strong scent of an agreeable mixture of coffee, tobacco, glue, oil paint, fine French varnishes, lacquer, solvents, and mysterious mixtures. Near the wash basin, lined up in a row on various small tables, were boxes of paints, palettes, tubes, little pots of color, glue mixtures, gesso mixtures, and mysterious pastes, spirit stoves, long and short brushes with thick and thin bristles or hairs, spatulas of all kinds, burins, etching needles, drawing pins, small knives, tweezers, and in addition, strips of linen, canvas, Japan and wove papers, smooth cardboard, inks, small pieces of canvas, grounded and ungrounded, everything seemingly random, yet within reach in the order which the pictures required them. To be sure, Klee was by no means alone among his contemporaries in exploring innovative technical practices. At present, you can see some historic examples here in the Met exhibition, Cubism in the Trompe-l'œil Tradition, where we encounter works by Braque, Gris, and Picasso incorporating printed oilcloth, newspaper, patterned wallpaper, musical scores, sand, and printed labels of various kinds. They paved the way for Kurt Schwitters, the Berlin Dadaists, the Russian constructivists, among others, and opened the way for radical technical experimentation and innovation by other artists. Klee, too, should be part of this story, and yet up to now he has not been. Even in the vast literature on Klee, this distinctive, fundamental aspect of his art has never been adequately examined, either in exhibitions or scholarship. This may be because his mediums were mostly traditional ones: oil, watercolor, gouache, tempera, and in the 1930s, pastel. Only his use of colored paste in his later years departs from conventional mediums. The magic, to adopt Schreier's language, lies in what he did with them. More unusual was his choice of supports and his treatment of them. Linen canvas has no privileged place in Klee's pictorial practice. His supports include glass, over 60 works, muslin, gauze, cotton, burlap, silk, damask, batiste, cardboard, brown wrapping paper, newspaper, stationery, and wove laid in Japan fine art papers. To offer an adequate overview of this topic in the span of 40 or so minutes would be impossible. Indeed, the more time I have spent researching this, creating synoptic tables of Klee's various combinations of materials and mediums, the more daunting such a task appears, because he produced such a vast spectrum of combinations. What I'll do this evening is give a small sampling of the variety within Klee's technical practice, discussing a few selected works, the majority of which are in the Met's Berggrund collection. In conclusion, I'll offer some thoughts as to what the implications of this technical practice might be for art historical method. In 1911, Klee began keeping a running catalog. Sorry, I forgot to hit this. This is the slide of the catalog of the Berggrund collection done by Sabina Rewald. In 1911, Klee began keeping a running catalog of his production in which he recorded his materials with varying degrees of specificity and completeness. This is the last page from his catalog for the year 1916. You see 4 columns. From left to right, the catalog number of the work, its title, medium, and support. Klee almost always identified the maker of the paper and sometimes, as applicable, its characteristics such as thin or grainy or old or even bad. Here I have highlighted in red the make of various papers on this page from top to bottom: Italian Ang, French Ang, thin Fabriano, Ang d'Arche, and at the very bottom, a page of note paper torn from a small notebook. There are 11 watercolors listed on this page. 5 of those highlighted here are on plaster grounds, Gips or Gipsgrund in German, which Klee began to use with watercolor in 1914. In these cases, his entry isn't complete. He doesn't record that all are on fabric supports, linen for 4 of them, or in this case, cotton cloth. In the mid-teens, shortly after he began to embrace color in his art, Klee became very fond of doing watercolors on fabric, primed with gesso or plaster, as is the case here. One surmises it was in the interest of creating textural interest. This isn't canvas mounted on a stretcher, but irregularly cut pieces of cloth attached to a light paperboard mat with the ragged edges visible. This page also includes a sculpture made of plaster, outlined in purple here, and an oil painting on unspecified paper grounded with oil paint. It's significant that Klee's catalog comprised all mediums, not only easel pictures and watercolors, but drawings, prints, and his rare sculptures. For him, there was no hierarchy of mediums. The unusual treatment and combination of materials is only part of the story. There's also the matter of process. Klee's catalog rarely provides information on that. Yet there are a few instances in which he recorded the steps in the creation of a particular work. One of them is, for this one, Refuge from 1930 in the collection of the Norton Simon Museum. Above you see how he recorded the technique in his oeuvre catalog, simply as oil and watercolor on paperboard mounted on a stretcher with an original strip frame. The catalog raisonné, in contrast, is comprehensive as to the categories of material components of a work. Paper, for example, but not what kind of paper or make of paper, while omitting information often contained in Klee's own catalog. In this instance, his description omitted tempera as well as the plaster-coated ground of gauze. His notes on the verso of the work record 9 stages in its creation, which you can read here on this slide. We can be sure that hundreds of other Klees had an equally complex genesis. The process that went into this painting called to mind an anecdote related to me by the late Katie Bürgi, who with her husband Rolf had been a close personal friend of Klee and a major collector of his work. When as a graduate student I visited her home outside of Bern to view her collection, she recalled a comment Klee made about this astonishing work. The letter picture. The German is Buchstabenbild, letters as in letters of the alphabet. Here he has applied a sheet of paper over a complex multi-layered construction of pasted papers mounted on cardboard and nailed it to a wooden frame. They'll never guess how I made this one, he told her. To return to the page of Klee's oeuvre catalog I showed earlier, it includes a 6th watercolor on fabric. He records it as watercolor and pen on ungrounded airplane linen. This was not normal linen, but the denser linen used on the fuselage and wings of German warplanes, as you see here. Klee, conscripted into the war in 1916, had a desk job at a military airfield at the time and presumably used this material because it was ready at hand. It was often painted for purposes of decoration and camouflage. According to his descriptions in his oeuvre catalog, he used this material in at least 33 works between 1916 and 1920. One of those is in the Met's Berggrund collection, Tomcat's Turf, for which he attached two irregularly cut pieces of cloth to the paperboard support. It also exemplifies another feature of his practice. He often cut a work into pieces, recombining the segments in an altered composition. Originally, the two elements of Tomcat's Turf were united in this larger fabric from which the upper left and right corners had apparently been cut. The section outlined in the lower left became a separate work. There are two other examples of this practice in the Met Berggrund collection. For Temple Gardens, he cut a symmetrical image into three pieces and arranged them into a mini triptych with an asymmetrical, more dynamic composition. The Berggrund collection also has two watercolors, the firmament above the temple on the left and tower in orange and green, that were once part of a single sheet. This brings me back to Lothar Schreier's observation on Klee's magic kitchen. He mentioned small pieces of canvas, Leinwandstückchen in German, grounded and ungrounded. Small pieces, not canvases mounted on stretchers. Among the rarer combinations in Klee's vast oeuvre is oil on linen canvas mounted on a stretcher. Remarkably, it was not until 1919 that Klee, who turned 40 that year, employed a stretcher for a painting. It was for this work, Death in the Garden, Legend, on what he identified as handkerchief linen, yet he didn't mount it on a stretcher. It was one of 5 works cut from a single piece of cloth. He then mounted on paperboard and nailed the paperboard to a stretcher. He didn't record a work with a stretcher again until 1924, 5 years later. Not until 1929, in Klee's 50th year, did stretchers become common for his works with fabric supports. Moreover, through 1924, when Schreier left the Bauhaus, those small pieces were more often either gauze or muslin, 68 works, than linen canvas, 42. In the years 1916 to 1919, the most common fabric was airplane linen, always in small cut pieces mounted usually on paperboard. What might have been the reason for Klee's predilection for small pieces of fabric mounted on paperboard, or less frequently, wood panels? One may have been his proclivity for working in an open-ended way and then cutting out elements and recombining or augmenting them to make a composition. An exhibition in Düsseldorf in 1995 examined this aspect of his art, and the catalog documents 254 works that originated in this way out of 122 objects, a practice that extends throughout his career but is most common in the 19-teens and 20s. But I think most probably a more significant reason, an interest in emphasizing the artwork as a material construction, as a palpably handmade object. And fabric, be it muslin, gauze, linen, cotton, or burlap, mounted as a discrete piece, often with frayed edges, on paperboard or even another type of fabric, emphatically asserts its materiality. Here, from the Berggrund collection, is an example of a figurative work, a tiny one measuring a little over 9 by 8 inches, that emphatically asserts its status as a handmade object. Klee's title is usually translated as Small Portrait of a Girl in Yellow. In German, that would be Kleines Bildnis eines Mädchen in Gelb. But the German title is Kleines Mädchenbildnis in Gelb, which literally translated would be Small Girl Portrait in Yellow, subtly shifting the referent from the portrait of the girl to the type of object. The work's physical appearance reinforces that sense, as you can see here. It is so clearly a handmade object, not only with its vibrant staccato touches of oil paint and its primitively rendered image, with the visible tacks along the periphery of the canvas and the gap that isolates the canvas from the frame. And look at the crudeness of the homemade frame, with its seemingly random nail holes suggesting a recycled piece of wood, so thick it could be seen as a wooden box containing a painting. One of the ways in which Klee asserted the materiality of his works was through the use of plaster. He employed it in around 200 works and in a variety of ways. In roughly 60% of these, watercolor was the sole medium, and plaster endows these works with a physical body and pronounced textural dimension not inherent in the medium itself. Plaster is almost never an inert element for Klee, a neutral surface for the application of color. It is an active element in the creation of artistic form and the generation of visual interest. In Six Fishes, a small work of 1933, roughly 8 by 11 inches, executed in watercolor, waxed on plaster-infused gauze and mounted on plywood, it is the primary element of visual interest, overwhelming the simple composition. Here Klee inverts the hierarchy of medium and ground. The thickly encrusted, sorry, I jumped the gun there. The thickly encrusted plaster subverts the believability of the image of fish swimming in an aquarium. And is Klee making a visual joke here? How could fish possibly swim in this plastery morass? Compare it, for example, with the fish in Matisse's Goldfish in Sculpture, where the entire thinly painted surface assumes the aqueous translucence of the fishbowl. Stricken City, a work in oil on canvas from 1936, shows another way in which Klee inverts the conventional relationship between medium and ground. He incised his composition into the fresh, unpigmented plaster ground, and only then did he add a thin wash of brown oil color, probably going over it with darker shades once it was dry. Here you see his set of tools for structuring his grounds. The darkening of color around the ominous descending black arrow assumes a semantic dimension, suggesting the site of impact, darkened as if by fire, raining down from on high. Here's a photo I took with my cell phone of the work in raking light, which gives a better sense of its tactile richness. Another example of an incised plaster ground is Early Sorrow of 1938, carved into plaster on burlap, which became a support favored by Klee in the later 1930s. He had used it intermittently in earlier years, but it became his preferred fabric support after 1936. He used it in 139 works in those years, while employing linen canvas in only 21 during that period, and muslin and gauze in only 6 and 21, respectively. One reason for this choice may be that in the 1930s, Klee began working in larger formats, and the coarse weave of burlap helped preserve that assertion of materiality which he had cultivated in earlier works of smaller scale. Here you can see how the fusion of the wet plaster and the fibers of the burlap produced a coarse texture. Over the course of his career, Klee used burlap almost as often as he used linen canvas, 186 times according to the catalog raisonné. It's a poor material from a conservation viewpoint, and one wonders why Klee, who had such a profound knowledge and experience of the technical aspects of painting, would have favored it. I'll return to this question later. At the beginning of this lecture, I stated that among the 89 works in the Berggren collection, there were 74 different combinations of materials. This takes into account different choices of support, including the kind of paper and the painted borders of many of the watercolors. The plurality of Klee's techniques parallels an astonishing plurality of styles, unmatched by any of his contemporaries. As an example, here's an array of works, all from the year 1925. We find figurative and abstract, linear and painterly styles, not to mention a variety of mediums and techniques. This tells us something about Klee's approach to his craft. At no time after 1905 does he have a default style, a default technique, or a default medium. In an insufficiently known paper, the late Yale art historian George Kubler offered a radically expanded redefinition of style that encompassed every aspect of an artwork that was the result of choice, including subject matter, medium, and technique. A style he proposed was constituted from, I quote, synchronous choices among synonymous possibilities, an abstruse formulation to be sure. I found it helpful to think of it like a restaurant menu. The synchronous choices are all the dishes available at a given time on a particular menu. The synonymous possibilities are all the dishes within a specific category, soups, appetizers, entrees, etc. One can compose a wide range of different dishes or different meals by how one combines particular items out of each category. Klee approached painting in this way. For him, form, medium, and technique represent different categories of the menu, and the range of his choices and their possible combinations is extraordinary. Here I think Schreier's metaphor of the magic kitchen is particularly apt. Klee differs from most other artists in treating formal vocabulary, technique, and medium in their combinations as always variable. Certainly there are patterns to his choices in any given year, but those patterns fall within an exceptionally broad and variegated latitude. Given the extraordinary variety in Klee's handling of his materials and his plurality of styles, it would seem a hopeless endeavor to find a common denominator in his practice. Nevertheless, I think I have found one that works a good part of the time. There is often an inverse relationship between the respective qualities of pictorial structure and material structure. Where the one is simple, the other tends toward complexity. Where he was working with simple schematic forms, he tended to create visual interest with a complex material structure. Where the formal structure was complex and intricate, he tended to favor texturally inconspicuous grounds. Let's look at some examples. Clarification, a work of 1932, is one of the largest and technically one of the most conventional works in the MetSpeaks Klee collection. It is oil on stretched canvas. Its surface is unassertive, a neutral ground for the complex pictorial configuration, a visual polyphony of three structures, a linear structure of interlocking rectilinear forms, a muted ground of pale solid color forms, and an interplay with these two structures, a pointillist scrim, which by means of its own color patterns creates a third layer of forms in counterpoint to the other two. Oops. Here is an example of the opposite type, is a watercolor from the following year, 1933, in which texture is dominant and the formal apparatus is simple in the extreme. It is titled Time, Die Zeit, and is roughly 8.5 by 10 inches. Here the visual interest lies overwhelmingly in the material structure. It's one of Klee's rare collages, in this case 4 layers of gauze infused with plaster, their weave patterns moving in contrasting directions. One of the technically most astonishing works in the category of examples, formal structures with texturally neutral grounds, is Astrological Fantastical Portrait, a watercolor of 1924, also in the Berggren collection. In his Urba catalog, Klee described this as pinselzeichnerisch, like a drawing executed with a brush on Eng paper on a black ground of colored paste. As Rachel Mastalish explained to me, the black paste ground makes the satin for a satin smooth finish more so than with gesso. The watercolor medium is in this instance obviously very dry to allow for this kind of precision, executed with fine brushes such as you see here alongside Klee's watercolor box, building up an intricate structure of hatchings and cross-hatchings. Here the ground of the sheet is extremely smooth so as not to compete. The focus is on the labor-intensive figuration itself, which has the graphic density of an Albrecht Dürer engraving. Another work in this category, yet stylistically different, is Bird Wandering Off from 1926. It is one of over 200 works in which Klee employed a spray technique, usually with watercolor, using stencils to construct the design. In this work, the entire sheet is created out of fine mists and veils of color, producing a surface of exquisite delicacy and nuance. In this detail, you can see how complex this work is with overlapping stencils and multiple layers. Only the foliage and the head of the bird are painted with a brush. Looking at this work in the lab yesterday, I was awed by the complexity of these porous layers of fine spray. Look, for example, at the barely visible, here's my pointer here. Is this working? There, okay. There's a circle right here, which you don't even see at first. It's like the longer you look at it, you begin to find other forms coming out. Another work in this category, and also this wonderful crepuscular color around the foliage up there. I wish that Klee had made a list of his procedure for this one like he did for Refuge. It just it would seem impossible to reconstruct the genesis of a work like this. And here you have the materials that he used. This is a box for which he kept the tools for his spray paintings. And here you see a demonstration by people at the Centrum Paul Klee in Bern of ways in which he used this, he produced these spray works. Turning now to works with more schematic forms, but with richly textured grounds, the MetSpeaks collection has a splendid example, personal favorite, Mural from the Temple of Longing Thither, a work of 1922, executed in watercolor, with drawing traced in black oil paint on plaster-infused gauze mounted on paperboard. The title, inscribed on the lower right, tells us this work is not a picture of a mural, it is a mural. This is a patently ludicrous claim. This mural is only 10 3/8 by 14 1/4 inches in size, a mural you could hold in your hand. And it's obviously not executed on a wall on what is conspicuously a piece of fabric, which with its textured plaster surface evokes a fresco. In this detail, you can see the tactile surface created by the free application of plaster with areas in which the loose weave gauze is clearly visible. Klee's predilection for loose weave fabrics like muslin or gauze coated with plaster or less often with gesso serves to emphasize the artwork's materiality. Mural is executed in a technique that Klee developed in 1919 and used intermittently for the rest of his career. A draftsman by natural disposition, he strove to find a means of working in which line and color preserved their respective independence, exercising different functions in the composition. Line should not be a passive contour to color shapes. Color should not be a mere filler for a linear configuration. In 1919, he developed the oil transfer technique, which is demonstrated here in a series of photographs made by the conservators at Centrum Paul Klee in Bern. The initial drawing is in pencil and is then a sheet, a second sheet is brought in and a coat of black oil paint is applied to it. For those of you who are old enough to remember carbon paper, it's that principle. And then this is put face down on a third surface. You see a piece of paper, but sometimes fabric, as is the case of the mural. And then it's with a sharp instrument, he goes over the pencil drawing, sometimes selectively, not always transferring the entire drawing. And then that's transferred to the surface. And then the watercolor, because the oil paint is waterproof, the watercolor can be painted freely over the drawing and then recede. So the drawing remains intact. A truly extraordinary work in the category of simple, formal vocabulary and richly textured ground is still life, vases, fruit, Easter egg curtains, an oil painting from 1927, also in the Berggruen collection, measuring roughly 19 by 25 inches. This is an exceptionally rare case within Klee's oeuvre. It is the fifth of only 8 works in which the support is a solid slab of plaster. It is mounted on a fine wire mesh nailed to an inner wood frame. Here on the back, you can see how Klee pressed the wire mesh into the fresh plaster and let it ooze through the interstices. And for some reason, he painted over the dry plaster with this brownish paint. And you see a sticker on the right that reads "Made in Germany," which was probably attached when the work was imported to Hollywood by his Hollywood dealer, Gulka Shire, in 1933. After we examined this work, Isabelle Duvanois had an X-ray made. And here we wanted to see how this was constructed. And so you can see 2 rows of nails. The inner course attaching the wire mesh. You see the nails moving outward, attaching the wire mesh to the inner frame, and the outer course driven in from outside, the outside edge of the frame and visible in it, connecting the outer frame to the inner frame. You can also see very faintly, I don't know if it works here, you can see very faintly the very fine wire mesh. Here's a photo of the work placed horizontally in raking light, in which you can clearly see both the inner and outer frame and this extraordinary textured surface. And see how the plaster, it sinks in concavely into the frame, and it also sort of buckles and heaves slightly. And here's another detail just to give you an idea of the quality of the surface. Of course, with an artist as inventive and fecund as Klee, there is no rule. And the work that illustrated the announcement of this lecture upends the neat dichotomy I have just proposed. Strange Garden from 1923 is a work that is both an intensely detailed formal apparatus and a complexly textured surface. Catalog Raisonné describes it as follows: watercolor on plaster ground on gauze, bordered with gouache and ink, below margin strip with watercolor and ink on light paperboard. This is an astonishing work. Klee spread the plaster freely onto the gauze, creating an irregular surface with slight lumps and ridges and fissures. It appears that these irregularities of the surface stimulated his fantasy and generated certain forms, as you can see here, where he shapes the curved edge of the plaster into the contour of an owlish face. And here in this, I apologize, I had not, I took photos on 2 occasions. The first one, I wasn't clear what was going on. So this is cropped. But this face in the lower right, you have there, you can't tell in the slide on the left, which is frontal, but when it's seen in raking light, And this is how he's finding figures in just these sort of arbitrary random shapes made by the plaster. It's like these lips, these pouty lips down in the very lower right. The plaster is protruding there, and so he discovers a pair of lips there. This sort of break in the nose above that. And then the eye that's right on the edge, and this is where I wish my camera had taken in more. That's an actual sort of lump, a circular lump of plaster, and in it he's seen an eye. And you can find this many such cases of this throughout the painting. I'm reminded, looking at this work, reminded of Leonardo's advice to artists to look at old stained walls as a stimulus to pictorial fantasy. I quote him, "The mind of the painter is stimulated to new discoveries. The composition of battles of animals and men, various compositions of landscapes and monstrous things such as devils and similar things. That seems to have been the case in Klee's strange garden, responding not to a wall, but to his own surface of plaster slathered on gauze." In a number of works, Klee's emphasis on the materiality of the artwork included the thematization of the physical life of artifacts, their duration, alteration, and material decay through time. I've identified over 100 objects that fall into this category. In a wonderful appreciation, the painter André Masson cited, I quote him, "Klee's taste for the used, the abraded, the corroded aspect of objects, terming it an aesthetics of erosion. As Masson saw it, Klee desired, and I quote Masson again, his works, so innovative, appeared to bear the weight of 1,000 years. Tablet of a young forest, which you see here, executed in oil with rows of graphic signs incised into a plaster ground on muslin, is a rich example of this aesthetic. What exactly is this tablet? What is its purpose? What do these marks signify? It appears to be some arcane hieroglyphics of the botanical world. It belongs to the category of what I call Klee's fictive artifacts. Beyond their status as real artifacts, they offer themselves as artifacts of a different kind, of some distant, unclear origin. The forest may be young, but this tablet bears the traces of the ravages of time and long exposure to the elements, like an old gravestone. Another example of his aesthetics of erosion, it could also be called a poetics of erosion, is a work from 1933, Weathered Mosaic, likely inspired by Klee's memories of work seen on his 6 trips to Italy. Technically, it's straightforward. Watercolor on Japan paper, toned in brown, presumably to dampen the intensity of the color. There is no image here, just a faint suggestion of a cross. The subject here is the fate of a surface, outliving its intended function and culture and suffering neglect, with a simulation of the effects of time created by cloudy blotches of watercolor suggesting the formation of mold. Recall Klee's watercolor Time, which presented time as layered, in which diachronic processes are presented synchronically. One final example of this type. This is Inscription, a work in ink and watercolor from 1926 in the collection of the Guggenheim Museum. And here we have a parody of some ancient, indecipherable textual fragment in which Klee, with delicately modeled brownish washes, has simulated the effect of aged, discolored paper, complete with foxing that speckles its surface. The inscription remains incomprehensible, indecipherable. What attracts us is the sheet's traces of its survival through time. Its status as an object estranged from its original meaning and function, as it comes down to us primarily as an object of aesthetic pleasure. It is that experience that is thematized here, a common experience of the modern age in which once functional ancient objects have an aesthetic afterlife in a museum or private collection. Klee's interest in the physical vicissitude of artworks and their susceptibility to the passage of time may help explain his choice of fugitive materials in his final years. Color paste, which contains little binding medium and tends to brittleness and flaking in an increasing proportion as pigment is added, burlap, and newspaper. It's almost as if, given his aesthetics of erosion, Klee were openly cultivating transience and decay. 3 Swiss conservators with extensive experience treating his work have observed that given his, and I quote, profound knowledge of painting techniques, he must have been aware that these unorthodox combinations of material jeopardized their stability. In their view, his later art is defined more by his acceptance of material change than the intention of provoking decay. Klee's use of these unstable materials dates from the last years of his life, when he was suffering from an incurable autoimmune disease, scleroderma, affecting the body's connective tissue. Scleroderma, literally a hardening of the skin and potentially of the organs. One need only compare these 2 photographs from 1935, the year before he became ill, and 1939, the year before his death, to see its devastating physical effects. Erasmus Weddigen, conservator emeritus at the Kunstmuseum in Bern, who treated many works by Klee, suggested a connection between Klee's choice of mediums and supports in his late works and his own fragile health, namely that he came to accept that his artworks were as mortal as he was. I find that thought endows this work, Little Hope, it's the title, in watercolor on plaster on burlap mounted on paperboard from 1938, a year when Klee's disease was advanced, with a powerful expressive resonance. So what ultimately are we to make of Klee's unique and extraordinary technical practice of these productions of his magic kitchen? In preparing this lecture and reflecting on my research, I have come to see its historiographic and methodological significance as profound. Let me explain. For the longest time, art historians treated the techniques and materials of art solely as a subservient vessel of form. Accordingly, they were usually excluded from the established models of stylistic analysis. The art historian Meyer Shapiro, in a classic critical examination of various theories of style, originally published in 1953, wrote that, I quote, "In general, the description of style refers to 3 aspects of art: form elements or motifs, form relationships, and qualities, including an all-over quality which one may call the expression." He explicitly excluded technique and materials from his definition, for as he explained, these features are not so peculiar to the art of a period as the formal and qualitative ones. It was George Kubler, It was George Kubler, whom I mentioned earlier, who included both material and technique in his analytical model of style under the term craft. Craft, he wrote, can be articulated as reciprocals of material and technique in varying relations of harmony and tension. These relations will affect all other dimensions of the artwork. Craft, he continues, is therefore like a fundament on which every other aspect of the artwork rests. In the case of Klee, we have seen that this is definitely the case. Indeed, I think an argument could be made that to a large extent, it is Klee's inexhaustible penchant for technical experimentation that drove his extreme plurality of style. Going back to the slide I showed earlier of a sample of works from 1925, one can see that each of these works is in a different technique. Could it be that in Klee's case, technique and material are much of the time not the servant of form, but its generator? that form is a byproduct of technique, that it is the subordinate component in this relation. We can find an example of technique as the generator of form as early as 1906. Klee, trying to break out of the tight linear style of his first major work, his etching cycle of 1903 to 1905, took up painting and drawing on glass. And here you see the contrast between his etching, Hero with One Wing of 1905 and Dwarf Under a Tree of 1907. The super smooth surface of the glass induced the kind of broad fluid treatment you see here. Technique and material are the determinants of style. Through my 5 decades of looking at and writing about Klee, I have found an assessment by the French historian and critic Michel Foucault to be one of the most astute, one that best grasps its historical and artistic significance, and I quote, "It seems to me that Klee's painting best represents, in terms of our century, what Velázquez was able to do in relation to his. To the extent that Klee renders visible all of the gestures, acts, graphisms, traces, lineaments, surfaces, which are able to constitute painting, he makes the very act of painting the manifest and brilliant knowledge of painting itself. His painting is painting grasped anew by the knowledge of its most fundamental elements. And these elements, apparently the most simple and spontaneous, the very ones that do not appear and that it seems never ought to appear, it is these that Klee distributes over the surface of the painting." Foucault doesn't explicitly mention technique or material here, but I think his remarks are complemented and underpinned by those of Lothar Schreier on his impressions of Klee's studio. For the fundament, to use Kubler's term, of those gestures, acts, graphisms, traces, lineament, surfaces, was Klee's inventive, resourceful, and ingenious application of those tools and materials in his studio, which Schreier aptly dubbed the magic kitchen. Thank you.